My name's Andy Zammit, and I'm going to be doing this Q&A with this esteemed gentleman who's come all the way from New York, Michael Pelczynski. We're very lucky. It's a rare appearance in Berlin. I don't know how to introduce you. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, but I'll give a brief as best I can. Michael is an expert on many things, especially coming from royalty and accounting from major labels. Then, notably, Michael is the architect of SoundCloud's fan-powered royalties, which is a very admirable project, which we'll talk a little bit about, so I won't go into too much depth here because I'm going to ask you some questions about that. And now is a consultant, company, his own consultancy firm, Forms and Shapes, working, advising many different players from different sectors in the industry, mostly masters. Is that right? You would say on AI, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go there. Don't worry. But yeah, so I invited Michael because we've had very many candid conversations in the past, and you're very outspoken and say it how it is. So we decided jointly to name this Q&A "Shaping the Future Now," which might sound a little bit ambitious, but ultimately that's kind of the goal. And I'm not saying that we're going to achieve that here in the 45 minutes that we have.
Yes, we are.
We are? Okay. We did it like about an hour ago, so I feel like we might have exhausted that part of the conversation. But yeah, I guess let's start at the beginning, where we're at as a whole, collectively, the industry as a whole. What would you say is the underlying situation, the problems that we face, the challenges that we face right now?
I'd say challenges-wise, wherever you are in the industry, whatever your role is, I think it's fragmentation. Because usually, going back 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the means of making a living in music was much more clearer. It wasn't as ironically, in one way it's consolidated. Streaming is one of the main, if not the main way of how rights holders make revenue. But at the same time, there's fragmentation because it's simple, almost overtly simple economics of whoever has the most plays makes the most money. So that impacts culture. It fragments how artists, labels, how they operate. And that fragmentation that I was seeing while I was at SoundCloud, I had the view and perspective of seeing how an entire global platform operates, how the cultures are shaped on it, where new scenes are coming about. But those new scenes never really had the ability to thrive because if you think of the economics, it was all in one big pot. So even if you had a community of 100 to 1,000 people that fell in love with this community and it was doing something, streaming economics never really supported that because it's you and that community against everything else for a share of some pie. No one really cared about this because seemingly there was many arguments and debate that say, well, everyone's getting a share of a pie, so everyone's making some money. But ultimately, I think the problems we're facing today stems from that because it changed the incentives. Right? It changed how independent bodies look at this, how independent labels, major labels. It just changed decision-making. And if you snowball that from 6 to 4 years ago to now, that fragmentation is a problem because now you have the threat of AI, of generative music, of streaming fraud, of all these things that there was signals of it, and people were really not happy to hear about it, even though it was affecting their businesses, their livelihoods, their roles. So that's what I mean when I say fragmentation, because there really wasn't that unity in the business side of it, where it used to be independent labels, for example, or independent communities had their own economies. They had their own sub-economies, you could even call it, where now we have to play this, game together of streaming while at the same time culturally nothing could be further apart from each other than a Taylor Swift and a stoner rock band that have to share the pie of the money. So I think that's the basis for this whole kind of, you know, schism and fragmentation, that, not going into the AI situation yet, but yeah.
So, I mean, you talked about it in terms of ebb and flow economics. I guess from an outside perspective, it might seem totally rational for it to be based on market share, and it does. You know, intuitively it makes sense. But you put it very beautifully in your writing when you say this, you know, it's moved to what's called what you call ebb and flow economics, as opposed to a transactional system, which was basically what the physical market was. So intuitively for me, I'm like, okay, that makes more sense, because I'm old enough to remember the dominance of LPs and CDs as a label, and so it made the transactional element. You buy a CD for $10 and that money goes to the label via the record store, then to the artist. No, it's not that, of course. It's pro rata. So the implications are kind of the effects that have come down the line, but surely that was predictable, and the industry bought into that model. So who's to blame for that? You know, not being able to predict that, or maybe they did but didn't care.
I mean, everyone's to blame for it.
Okay, who's really to blame? Give me some names.
John Smith. No,
okay. No, we're all to blame, of course. But in terms of the industry as a whole, bought into it. And now kind of, I guess, if anyone who was here last night and when I interviewed Christoph, there's not regret, but it's like, how did it get this bad? But it was the system that was endorsed. You know, I think you mentioned earlier that it was meant to change, but it didn't change.
Yes. So it's in the beginning, that pro rata model, oversimplifying it, meaning this room of however many of us here in here, wherever the most of all of our plays goes is where the majority of the money goes. That's not an economic model that should be placed on something that's the music business, because music inherently is incredibly emotional. You could apply that to shipping, you could apply that to other businesses, that it doesn't have the nuance of the individual. The way we all interact with music is incredibly different, even if some of us like similar music. Which also is ridiculous in one way, because the businesses and the labels and some of the people or entities that were responsible for that mistake should have seen that as the technology evolved and everything is still on this pro rata way of paying, they had the opportunity to evolve the way it pays too, in parallel to that technological advancement, because our behaviors with how we interact with music arguably in some ways is even more valuable than the money itself. And someone on the business side should be able to see that, to start to think about new business models that support every faction of music. But then why do that and why change it if you figured out how to make it work for yourself, if all you have to do is make playlists, point a bunch of bodies in that one direction and just garner plays? The math is so simple that, you know, executives like to go home and do whatever they do at home and have less problems. Like, it's the truth of it. Like that, I've been in those scenarios, in those rooms where you see the opportunity to make that decision, to challenge that status quo. So what ended up happening at SoundCloud was obviously a few years too late, in my opinion, to make that change, because the business became so dependent on that way of just driving this pro rata model, pursuing volume, and then starting to even sign acts and repertoire because it's good for volume. That's a shorter song, fantastic. I get more plays for that 45, 50 seconds than that 5-minute song.
Yeah.
That was a consideration that every format before that actually gave the opportunity to change how you actually how you make music. Every format gave you more space and real estate for music. This was the first one that the financial incentive said, actually, no, the shorter song, that's a great idea. We'll get more plays. So the moment that starts to influence the art, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you saw an opportunity when you joined SoundCloud because of the way that SoundCloud has different businesses within its under one roof, you saw an opportunity to be able to test what's called a user-centric. That kind of coincided, I mean, obviously you were working on it before that, but it kind of coincided with the pandemic, and there was a spotlight shone on the failings of streaming in terms of, you know, bringing in a sustainable income for labels and artists. So there was a lot of, I remember when it happened, there was a lot of conversations happening in the UK. For example, there was the hashtag Broken Record. Tom Gray was very vocal about this, and there was a lot there was a parliamentary inquiry, actually. There was a lot of conversations about how do we challenge this pro rata model which doesn't work for the majority. And along comes your launch of the user-centric model, which I'm just going to say one more thing. There was a part of the reaction to this conversation. I think Spotify said, well, it's so difficult to run user-centric. Actually, you know, in terms of the programming required to do that kind of accounting, it's too complicated. It's just too complicated. And you came along and pretty much called them out on that, in a sense.
There's lucky circumstance to that, though,
right,
too,
okay.
Because SoundCloud, being the company that early on decided that when they were building up the platform, do we build or do we buy? When they were building things, do you license a royalty system? Do you, all these things in terms of the platform itself, how much of it do they build themselves, like a Google, aspiration, versus let's get these pieces done by a buy piece, or we license the way to do those things. So luckily, there was always this really overhanging challenge, and I give a huge credit to the engineers there, because everyone actually gave a shit about music. So there was this mantra and ethos of like, well, let's try to build it and build it better. So that was the one lucky circumstance, that everything that they did in terms of calculating the money, royalties, usage, all of that was homemade. It was made in-house. And that's very rare. So a lot of these other companies have dependencies on third-party pieces. So there is some truth to that, saying it's really hard for us to do this differently because, there's probably a piece of the bike that doesn't allow them to take, to ride that bike.
Okay.
But ultimately, if they really wanted to, that is bullshit, because they can go probably figure out and build it in a way that they can forego that dependency. But yeah, I mean, it was something that, and maybe just to add even another thing that's a lucky circumstance is, at SoundCloud, the engineers were allowed on Fridays to have their own time to look into any other project they want to. Every Friday they could use to experiment and try new products and things. So myself and three other individuals were like, let's just build one. So between the four of us, we filled 6 roles. I went to school for economics. I never thought I would ever use it. And then it was time to use Fridays to build and iterate and do it slowly with no oversight. And then we got to a point where we were like, holy shit, we have the workings of a user-centric model. How do we actually start to think of launching it? And how do we actually show this to the rest of the leadership and not get fired? And then before that was the one thing that we started seeing was streaming fraud. So for anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's essentially, when people are using fake accounts to bot to get more plays, essentially to get more money, or to just, you're not even involved in music, people are botting in gaming and creating fraud to launder money and many other things, and I can confirm that. So that there was this threat, because that model never evolved and never developed again as it should. And the idea came, the way to get this adopted was, there was complexity, because you couldn't just have one thing and then you have this other model, this other machine, and then you just turn one off and put the other one on. So the way I thought about it was, on my left hand, you have the entirety of SoundCloud generating money, revenue, calculating, and all that. Then we built the entirety of everyone, again, majors, indies, direct creators, everybody making money on user-centric, so the 2 parallel models. By doing that, the one thing that was fascinating is that if you look at person A here and person A here, you always saw a difference between how they would get paid. But in some instances, you saw the person go from high, maybe revenue generating, to incredibly low. Or you saw the opposite, someone that wasn't generating that much money, all of a sudden making multiples. So looking at that, it was going to serve two purposes. One was it would naturally combat fraud. And I'll go through an example with everyone in the room to explain why it matters and why it makes a difference. And then the other thing was, what I started calling was, it naturally inherently rewards fandom, which is why everybody's fucking abusing that term now. Because fandom existed since the beginning of humanity, right? I mean, it's an inherent thing of our nature where we become obsessive or enthralled with something. So, and unfortunately, I pitched our major friends and others with this whole superfan proposition, and now we can't hear the end of it. And I know this is being recorded, but it's fine. But the thing was, the fraud thing was the way that got everyone to be comfortable with this, because it immediately gave that value. And now I'll give an example. So say there's, I don't know, 50 of us in this room. And let's just say I'm the bad actor. And I've taken 50 other people outside this room, and I'm using their accounts to just flood this room with plays that are not by genuine human beings. But every single one of our 10 euro, dollar, pounds, and our pie over here, I'm impacting it by those accounts, or I'm trying to siphon it from some of your accounts. Under pro rata, it's a complete exposure. You're just shifting money from one end to the other. Now, all of a sudden, we're no longer that kind of model. We're user-centric, where every single one of our subscriptions is essentially capped to your behavior. It's your 10 euro dollars, and if you listen to one artist, that whole 10 euro goes to that artist to get calculated for royalties, or you listen to 1,000, it gets split up 1,000 ways. But what that also does, it doesn't allow for me to use bots and flood or do anything to your 10 euro. Your 10 euro is completely unimpacted. And this was the beginning to your question, which is, as we started combating fraud and showing how much is saved, there was a Robin Hood moment where it's like, wow, the fraud that we knew was there, some of it we've never seen because it's so smart. Very wide account number, low play, botting. We were able to identify this stuff just by looking between these two models. So that opened up the huge thing and legitimized it. But then there was the other thing, again, pro rata, I'm making multiples here. What that meant was, and your initial question was, what's the problem we have now? That was the beginning of solving that, because I could have 1,000 listeners, and I have an average, let's say, a quarter of each one of theirs monthly attention. They're listening to my bodies of work as a label or an artist. I'm getting a quarter of almost all of these 1,000 subscriptions. That mounts up to a significant amount of more money than if I had 100,000 listeners in pro rata generating hundreds and thousands of plays. So it's this challenging way to kind of articulate it, but it didn't matter that AI was coming to flood platforms. If, let's just say a quarter of this room were people that became massive fans of AI generative slop, it doesn't matter to the rest of us in the room, because our 10 pounds, $10 or euro is going only to what we listen to. It doesn't matter. We're not impacted.
Yeah.
So that was the huge thing, that then it allowed for the runway, for the consideration to do this and do it big.
Yeah, and it was you beautifully kind of proved that, and it was discussed, and there was an expectation from certain people, bystanders, spectators. Oh, okay, this is good news. This is going to catch on. Yet it never caught on in any kind of widespread, meaningful way. So, if such an obvious solution for some, not all, because obviously what we just discussed there, on the pro rata model, there are people who are benefiting from that. Not just the fraudsters now, legitimately, the big players. So why, for example, Deezer were also threatening to launch user-centric, and then that morphed into artist-centric, which is kind of like a compromise, a kind of, dare I say, half-baked user-centric.
Okay.
But it never took off. So why is that kind of conversation? It seems to have disappeared a little bit. And from your point of view, what do you think that's something that needs to be resurrected, or?
I think actually you mentioned the parliamentary hearings. That was very important. There was a lot of conversation between back channels with Parliament, the MPs, and stakeholders. There was a lot of there was supposed to be some public conversation about that, but that didn't happen. And I think the reason I mention that is because a lot of that sentiment and concern about moving models propagated across the business. Everyone, there's a lot of key players saying, what would happen if this changed? What would happen if most of these platforms shifted? What would happen if Spotify adopted this, right? Then everyone was fearful that there would be swings and where would this go? And so, in short, it became political. However much of that was in the public and however much was not public. And that's the truth of it. And I think the value of trying to explain this is complicated. Like even me trying to equate it to this room and how we behave and how we listen to music, like it's still difficult to get it and for it to click, and then you have to wait 30 days to get your payout from a platform to see that thing I did that work? Mm-hmm. So I think there is still a huge amount of room to do it. I think there's new platforms, new DSPs coming out this year that are, one of them is purely user-centric, the whole thing. I helped them build that one. And it's an independent-only streaming platform. And I think there's more alternatives coming. So I think that's the key phrase to think about, where when do these things, companies, platforms, whatever it is, start to have natural decay because people are taking music off of them, their ethos is not, merging with what the general ethos of music industry is. Someone mentioned in a workshop the enshittification, which I credit to, Darren.
Hemmings?
Yeah, Darren Hemmings, yeah. To making that more public, like that really is, there's a time for everything, and I think it'll happen, except what happens what are the alternatives? Will they be ones that will take care of these problems, or at least partially? But it is a huge thing. It is something that, and it has died out. Yeah. And it's...
So on the one hand, I mean, last night, when we had this panel, there was a lot of, I wouldn't call it doom and gloom, but, you just mentioned some alternatives, but there seemed to be like a feeling that there is nothing on the horizon. But it's good to hear from you, because you're obviously consulting and seeing these things, that there are emerging alternatives. From a consumer point of view, we are kind of being, we've been very lucky to have the convenience of, I call it an all-you-can-eat buffet of everything that's available on digital platforms. I guess the challenge for any up-and-coming competitor, if they need to compete, would be getting the catalog that would satisfy these, us who expect an all-you-can-eat buffet. Is that what these alternatives are going to be offering, or are they going to be? Because there have been, like Resonate, etc. Where there's not been, the catalog has been niche that's available to you. So you're sacrificing maybe your favorite artists, or the big stuff, the classics, or whatever let's call it. It's a different proposition in that sense. So I'm curious, from your inside, conversations with these emerging platforms, how are they approaching this? Or is it top secret?
No. It's. I think you touched on the fact that it's very hard for things to come in and then get adopted.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing of alternatives is that everyone that's attending this here in the next couple of days and past day, we're here because we care, and we're trying to figure out where to put our attention and our money to make this whole thing a better thing. And I think however trite that sounds, it is something like that, where it's these bigger platforms will become more and more like Walmart and more of like these big chain stores, that the alternatives need to figure out how to become the mom and pop shop that even say you discover something from the algorithm because it's you've been a part of it for so long. There's value to that. But then the moment you discover the thing, we have to start to condition ourselves to go, okay, I'm going to go buy that at the local store, or I'm going to take it to this alternative platform because there's other values that I want from that thing that I enjoy, but at the same time, I know my money is going to that mom and pop. So I think culturally that has to happen, and then these things have to be compelling, like they have to have something to them that make people want to adopt them and use them. So there's that chicken and egg, what makes it exciting for someone to use, and is there enough of people there, or is it enough music there, whatever it is, to make it a legitimate alternative to be that, more boutique, community embraced thing.
Yeah.
Which is hard.
Yeah, I don't know what you mean about, we are all here, kind of longing for change. I think I spoke to someone last night who said that they felt ashamed when they're promoting their music on platforms that they feel do them a disservice, or that there's they're acutely aware of the negativity that surrounds them, and so they feel kind of a shame about that. So the question, I guess, would be,
that's a start.
Is it artist-driven, this change, or is the onus of responsibility on the consumer, us shifting our behaviors? I guess that you could apply that to any kind of, product, whether it's, I guess you're talking about ethical consumption, right? Mm-hmm. So in a way,
it's really difficult because if there's one rule, is that you should put your art everywhere you possibly can. And some of the platforms that are doing a disservice, it should with time do disservice to itself. Because if they're demonetizing plays, what else can you say other than what you're saying very loudly without saying the phrase, we don't value this in some way?
Yeah.
It's just finding another home is really challenging, because the one thing to add to your question, very expensive to build music tech, it's very expensive to build tech in music. And that's why I think to throw that in the conversation, that's another reason why alternatives haven't come up. Because these companies like Spotify and others and SoundCloud and whatever it may be have gone through such fucking crazy trepidation to get where they've gotten, that it's a very bizarre relationship that they have with the rights holders and rights holders with them and with artists, and that whole dynamic, that because it's expensive monetarily and getting the talent to build something, when it does happen, it becomes something that's like a lightning rod, and hopefully the way that it's built isn't tied to money or anything that went into it that does a disservice to it. That's something I've seen too, is that you get money from an investor or a VC or something, and then they bastardize the actual original mission that was meant to be built into whatever the thing that was built. Yeah. So there's a lot of that happening that people don't see, which is also disheartening.
It's disheartening because what you're saying is that the music industry itself, the rights holders, it's too expensive for the rights holders collectively, or definitely individually. So that's the tech industry is disrupted from the outside. So idealistically, it's the rights holders themselves who should own the platform or the players or whatever comes next.
The most beautiful thing would be if there was a way of artists and rights holders to own a platform. It's incredibly ideological,
sure.
But and then getting people to agree, good luck. But but there's something about that though, because there's a startup that I'm a co-founder of, VoiceSwap, and one of the other co-founders, Ben Jordan, who's very vocal in terms of everything music, and he's a data scientist in addition to being an artist, and he's heavily against copyright.
Yeah.
And I enjoy debating him because it's the only reason that he has what he has.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall in these boardroom meetings because that's your bread and butter. And
but that's the bread and butter that got
the pillars of the industry.
And the
copyright.
protection base, right? It's the thing that creates complexity but saves you from the void of not having that copyright and, you know, having ownership. So I think it's interesting because outside of music tech doesn't want to play with music because of that complexity. But because of that complexity, it's protecting itself. So if there was more of value that lived in music outside of, say, the major players, like distribution challenged that, right? Anyone can distribute music. That started to change that power dynamic. More was going through these other channels, democratized how to supply the world music, but then also now we have more music and most of it's not even being played. So it's this navigating the complexity to get to this thing, whatever it is that is the solution, is like the key thing that's super interesting about music. Not just the culture, but even just the solutions of it. Most aren't up for the challenge. May it be financing or...
You were definitely up for the challenge, and I was pleasantly surprised. We go back to the VoiceSwap AI, so you got involved with that. So you took your knowledge from, you know, SoundCloud and, you know, Warner's and etc. And now this is the new coalface, and you're there at the coalface yet again. So
because I'm a moron.
What? but you're an optimist as well, because you're like, okay, well, let's make let's using copyright, which is I'm surprised to hear that your colleague is so anti it actually.
Well, because I think he's very bohemian about it, and I respect that because as my parents were musicians. They emigrated from Szczecin, just not that far away from here. I grew up around musicians, all the parts of the culture, everything. I tried to fight it and not become one myself. I didn't want anything to do with it, but it's in your blood. And to that point, there's this just inherent, constant need that if there's an opportunity to try to do something together and bring that other part of our brains into the mix, I can't say no, neither can Ben and other people like him, because there's a blank canvas all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with the streaming situation is there's already 10, 15 years of precedence that everyone's pushing back against. And even just building that, licensing those deals with Warner artists and Merlin artists, those three things together for SoundCloud made more than half of everything that's monetizing on SoundCloud to be user-centric. That's a big accomplishment pushing against the past. This is a blank canvas. Mm-hmm. This is, okay, there's voice AI technology out there. It's being abused immediately out of the gate. How can we come together, get the right people to start shaping this business that becomes in its own an example of how to do this right? Not just ethical and responsible and how it makes money and all that, but how do you even use it as a tool? Half of us co-founders are, active or pastly active artists and musicians and producers. One of the original founders, Dan Stein, DJ Fresh, he legitimately was coding this thing from home after he was a consultant at Stability AI, and they insulted him, not knowing that he was DJ Fresh. And he asked them, what do you think about rights, for music, as he was consulting with them? And they're like, we don't believe in it.
All right.
So he was like,
okay.
And then he left. They offered him a job. He left and started building this. And before launching, Ben and myself and others, we got together, and then we were sitting there going, how would we use this? How would we use it creatively? And the biggest question was, how do we create a new revenue stream that doesn't exist before this technology? And that was the main thing that they initially hit me up about, like, how can we monetize this technology that creates new revenue? And already there was, for the life of me, what's her name? Grimes. She already was working on some of those things, and she said, go ahead, use my model for anything, just give me 50% of whatever you make in streaming. But that's after the fact. And one of the things we realized is that we really loved using this technology while we were working, while we were in our DAW, tinkering ideas, exchanging things. And then that's the realization was like, if we monetize the working process, every time you're converting a vocal, you're sharing a model for someone else to collaborate with you while you're basically sleeping, all of that, every inference, so inference is the term when you take, say, this recording of my voice, and then I'm going to create a voice model of you, and then I'm just going to infer everything I'm saying literally right now to sound like you. So every inference generates royalties. So we're creating royalties and payouts before anything is even finished and goes out into streaming or wherever. And that was crucial because that's where I got excited.
Yeah.
I wasn't just excited, okay, let me figure out this problem, but then I was like, holy shit. My mother was a professional singer, so like, for a vocalist now to have a new asset class of intellectual property, once this is legitimately done, that if I have a vocal model, or if my mother had a vocal model, it just means that she has another avenue of making money. If she had, or if I have an artist agreement with a label, or whatever my relationships with my partners, I have additional leverage because there's something there that now never existed before. Even before even knowing what the medium and application is, that was exciting after all the streaming wars bullshit, because it was like blank canvas, how do we do it right, that we think we could do it now, and then how could you future-proof that when something doesn't work out in 5 years, how can you evolve the economic thing, the tech thing, whatever it is. That ends up becoming really exciting, and it's been, it's been pretty rewarding and talking to...
So, but not just a revenue, presumably not just a new revenue stream and a new way of monetization, but emotionally, I guess, there's, I think you mentioned legacy, and, it outlives you, your voice outlives you. Is that a part of it?
Yeah, it's also one of those things that's scary and incredibly bewildering, and it's a legitimate thing. It's so I don't know if anyone's familiar with the artist Chuck Roberts, famous house vocalist, and we did a voice model with him, and he put it out publicly for people to use it. And sad to say, a year ago he passed away. And what was really interesting with his family was that they had this scenario where they had this ultimate loss. And we created this thing before he passed away, and now they have a vocal model of a family member and friend. And we, of course, took it down like any, respectable, like the way, well, labels don't really do that now when someone passes away with streaming. But, you pull everything back, and then you give the estate the opportunity to figure out what to do with that. Mm-hmm. And that's the first example of that happening. I got bombarded with lawyers trying to get, involved, because this would be, a precedent-setting situation.
Yeah.
But more importantly, the human aspect of that. Like to make this, I talked to my mother. We're doing dishes, I was visiting, and she surprisingly wanted to talk to me about her making a will and what to do, and my children, her grandchildren, as we're washing dishes, and she wanted to have this conversation. And during that, I asked her, if I could preserve your voice indefinitely, and speaking of, say, you passing away, and my younger child, my daughter, she's 6 now, this would have been when she was 4, and I could see that my daughter has a musical soul, like she's gonna be singing. And when my mother brought this up, my first thought was, okay, you're making me think of you die, my father died when I was in my teens, so I have some, baggage there. And I'm thinking of my daughter, and I go, because if I could do that with your voice, and you're no longer here, and she just starts to really get professional with her voice and vocals and whatever she does, she could still collaborate with you when she's 16, even though you passed away when she was 9. I'm just making this up. Absolute bewilderment and jubilation. She's like, how would that work? How would I do that? How could you really do that? And what would, and there was no concern, but this is a retired professional singer. You have that conversation with someone, us that are actively working, it starts with fear, concern, and as it should.
Yeah.
The unknown of it. But that was a conversation that I had that it made me realize once this becomes normalized, if it doesn't get abused by thoughtless design for economics or the tech or application or control, we eventually will be able to do that. We'll be able to control that, and whatever the application may be, there's something in there that is scary, but only scary if there isn't the right things in place. If there isn't, and I don't like the term guardrails because that just sounds like a rail, train is supposed to fall off of them. Like if there isn't protections in place that my mother's voice, the family can use it and do things with it and whatever it may be, but we know that it would never be abused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when you used the word normalize there, and I'm kind of curious, the fact that you use that word suggests that, I know that your mother's reaction was positive, but in terms of like across the board, is it quite difficult to not convert people, but to just try and paint the picture in a very accurate way because of the narrative that of AI, that is the fear that surrounds AI in general. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if that's like an obstacle.
The fear is usually when we can't own something. Even if it's not a tangible thing, it's even not being able to own a decision. You don't have a choice because you're screwed on your deal or whatever it is. Like I think it really is ownership. Because if you imagine all those instances and everyone in here that's thinking about this, about themselves, I do genuinely predict, I don't know how many years from now, but we will have our own voice models, even for the basic reason of saying this is the only source of truth of my voice. If I find it anywhere else, if there's a nefarious clone, whatever it may be, there is something akin to your social security number, your PESEL, whatever, it becomes a thing that this is mine, I own it. And I think that's the realization that people then start to understand, but that's the second thing that happens. The first thing that happens is when they realize, what can I use this for? What utility can I use this? Even if I create a private model, what can I use this to save time, money, or make money? Or be creative without bounds? And it starts with utility. And then when you make one for that use, and you tell them, oh, by the way, you created a source of truth that no matter what happens with the EU Act, no matter what happens in the United States, which is its own shit show at the moment, there's a No Fakes Act that's trying to get through bipartisan support. Good luck. But no matter with any of that, there is legal, contractual relationship between a voice talent artist with, say, voice swap. There's a commercial agreement there, and that's precedence to actually take it down from YouTube, others. So and then the road after that is to legitimizing that asset class with rights and copyright, which Ben and I, but it starts with utility. Sure. And to give you some examples, so some labels and or artists, managers and their teams, they create these models privately, so they don't chase their talent to record radio spots or to do other things that is really challenging to get time to do them. So those are things like, small functional things that then pay for itself, and then, people get creative with it because they realize they have it. Like Imogen Heap is one artist that we've been working with, and she's creating this, larger project with this. So it's everyone comes in from a different avenue, but then when you realize, oh, I'm owning this thing,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what happens, I'm actively protecting myself
Yeah.
for whatever comes next.
And so, as an example of how you can retain control of something that could otherwise be exploited, what's the outlook like for? We talk about copyright. Obviously, for AI, generative AI. Obviously, the scraping's already happened. You call it the great robbery's already happened. I think you said that.
Yeah.
Was it me?
No, well, both of us, whatever.
And you've written about it on your Substack. It's not Substack anymore. Sorry, Forms and Shapes, which I highly recommend, by the way. You talk about attribution share,
Mm-hmm.
how to identify and monetize and reclaim, I guess, something that's already kind of potentially already happened, and to claw that back. What's the outlook from your point of view? What's the outlook?
We're recording. It's so one thing to kind of frame for everybody. The voice side of AI is much more clear in terms of, like we said, ownership, right? Everyone in this room owns their voice.
Yes,
Unless you have a crazy 360 deal or something else or other weird, fun situations in music. But they're rare. And because of that, it's just much more clear in how to just build and do it right. Now, generative music, on the other hand, that's just this crazy complex amalgamation after the Great Robbery that, with the experience of what we were trying to do and successfully did to a certain degree at SoundCloud with the streaming reform, this is massive. The complexity compounds everything, every problem, every rights problem, royalty problem, metadata problem, ownership problem, across recorded side, publishing. It just compounds everything. So everybody's bullshit is out in the open.
But you don't shy away from it, though.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, you love
because,
it.
Well,
you have the challenge of, because you've tried to kind of frame it in a way. Well, how can we address how does the industry fix?
Yeah. And
this?
And I had the lucky circumstance that so Benji Rogers, who founded Pledge Music, ways back, great guy, and he has a consultant advisory agency as well, called Lark 42, and him and his two other partners, they came across this company called Surreal with two E's, Sureel, and their founder, to my PhD in explainable AI, he developed an attribution generative platform for images. And then at one point, as he built this out, he has patents for attribution. He starts saying, I really, actually based on what we just said earlier, he's like, I really would love to bring this to music. So the past year and a half have been an incredible lesson for him and the team of how hard it is to build in music, even if you have the solution for the biggest problem of the moment. And own the patents to do the thing, and you can prove it. And you're showcasing and proving the ability to do it with trade bodies. It's incredible to watch this. And then take a step back and have these conversations with executives and decision-making stakeholders across these music companies. And that piece that I wrote for the Forms and Shapes for the attribution share thing, it came from one conversation. It was a CEO of a very large company, music company, very intelligent. I have the utmost respect for him. And we were doing this, we were supposed to have a 45-minute meeting before he had another meeting, and it went for an hour and a half. And we were convincing him why it's important to do attribution. Don't do a deal with any generative AI platform without attribution in place. Or the promise of doing that in short term. You can't do a Facebook deal where it's okay, pay me a massive check, Facebook, see you in 3 years, and then potentially this happens, right? You have to, and they had a 3-year runway to build the thing, and they did it.
Can we explain can we kind of define attribution for anyone who might be getting lost with?
So attribution essentially is, and it's basically who gets paid for what that influence the outcome.
Yeah.
In a simple terms, but attribution for, say, generative music, it's I prompt, give me a Berlin-esque noir jazz piece that has lyrics of Leonard Cohen and make it themed like a birthday song. It's bizarre. But there's clear signals of Leonard Cohen, lyrics, jazz, and it's going to pull all these influences. And it's going to infer through basically an influence, chain of influence. It's going to pull hundreds of pieces of music composition and records, and something comes out. And then I'm going to refine it with another prompt, which then probably pulls another chain of influence. And then there's a way to attribute every single piece of composition and recording that went into that. Which again,
there's a trail. The prompts are the trail.
Yes.
So you would figure out who's.
Yeah. And every company that says they're incapable of doing that is complete bullshit. And even if some of them have a hard time doing it, they just don't see the value and cost in doing it. And then what didn't help is that music started to engage with these AI companies doing flat fee deals, meaning pay me a flat fee, I'll give you this for training, which was one of the most short-sighted things ever, because you're giving something transactionally once.
Yeah, and then the recipient of that transaction has no way of then feeding that money back to the creators, because if it's a label, let's say, and they are taking a fee, what do they do with that money? How do they then apportion that out? Do they just split it or keep it, or what do they do?
And we don't know.
Yet?
Yet.
Okay.
But that's why attribution is so important, because what that does is for everyone that has any form of music, it opens up another avenue of revenue. So as we're all making money from streaming, we're making money from physical things we're selling. If this thing, I just called it attribution share, you get a share of every single output that is influenced by you. Even if it's fractionally influenced by your body of work, you get a share of that attribution. It's an incredibly powerful thing that could happen that you almost don't even need to have such a concern about that, because even if it comes back to cannibalize streaming, you still made money at the creation of this generative technology.
Can I ask you another question in relation to that then? So if attribution is an interpretation or kind of like a compromise of copyright in a sense, it's like, okay, well, we can't identify exactly what copyrighted work exactly, but we'll take the best guess that we can based on these prompts, based on these little trails, as you mentioned. And so if the rights holders are basically saying, no, we don't want to do that, or for whatever reason, they kind of, are they indirectly or directly responsible for the degradation of copyright as a law, as a pillar? Are they kind of chipping away at that pillar?
I'd say, if I had to say yes to no, I'd say yes.
Okay.
But there's a gray area to that, because I think there's just miseducation on what's possible.
So it's not nothing sinister, it's just incompetence.
Oh, I wouldn't say nothing.
Okay.
Because there's also, there's lazy design.
Yeah.
And music industry's known for just like, oh, that's the easier route, let's just do that and figure it out later.
Yeah.
And then that thing became streaming.
Yeah.
Like it's like if there's one phrase of this whole theme of shaping the future now, it's just thoughtful design, thoughtful fucking design. It's like emulate the artists that you work with who are obsessive about thoughtful design, composition, sound, right? Like it's these companies. Oh, that's another big topic too, is just we're talking about, you had the earlier question about where the streaming model breaks and all these things. We're also a culturally driven business. So those decision makers, we need culturally rich leaders making those decisions. So to tie that back to this piece, that the attribution share thing is, I just wanted to touch on the fact that the reason I ended up publishing my homework was because that CEO conversation we had, and we get to the end of this conversation, and it became very fruitful in the end. And then in the end, the person just says, you know, but my team hasn't figured out a business model for this yet. And that was just really frustrating, because it was like, it was understood, because maybe they don't have the talent or the time to create thoughtful design, to design that thing. So I said, fuck it. I'm going to put this to paper, and I'm going to publish this, and go ahead, steal my homework. Because what was on the line was a wealth transfer. Because as people are just giving music away for flat fees, as others are not enacting anything or doing anything in terms of opting out or legally creating technical opt-outs, not just sending a letter that says, don't do that, we're just allowing, to your question, you're allowing and enabling the wealth transfer. And then companies like Suno are creating advertising, and Timbaland is creating these ways of normalizing using this technology to create samples, stem them out, and you have a generative music piece that you're going to use the bass line. But the perverse thing is you're using a small portion of your music somewhere in there that you're using as a sample of a generative element that you would have been credited for. Because you're using, do you understand the snake eating its tail?
Yeah.
So there's this really crazy existential thing with that, if it's not actually solved by those decision makers. And I did piss off a couple people with that piece, and it did eventually get to the point where it got to the point that large players were having conversations of what would this look like in a term sheet format. That happened. Some people are working through that, and then some people are still pissed off about it. But at least, to your question, they're being forced to think about it. They're being forced to think of how to design it.
Sure.
While there's alternative companies coming in and challenging it, trying to build that. But and there are some generative AI music platforms that are doing it authentically. Out of the UK, there's Delphos. Like they're focused on producers. So that's a really cool idea where they say, you're a producer, you have so much music that you've never released. Take everything and create your own model. And you can create a prompt-based generative thing to just work off of your hundreds and hundreds of bodies of work, right?
Yeah.
That feeds and naturally works with like how that person works and thinks, like a producer mindset, or a vocalist using voice swap or other things or even a producer approaching that. So it's this disconnect between that and how.
Going back to that point you made about the company then who said to you, well, we don't know how to do that, we can't do that, and then you published it, and obviously you pissed some people off.
Yeah.
It seems that you've got, for individuals or private companies who maybe don't have the capability to even envisage how to address the problem, or putting their heads in the sand, whatever. But that yet we have other opportunities to maybe kind of reinforce that protection. I might be wrong about this, but I feel like I might have heard Gamer make some moves on this in terms of protecting their writers, their members, in terms of.
Wait, where did you hear this?
I think I read something on their website. Maybe.
Is it recent?
Not that recent, but this year. Yeah, I need to. I'll come back to you on that one.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
Nothing conclusive there. Just food for thought. We can all Google it later.
No, but because they did it
because of the might of a copyright protection.
Yeah, because we're recording this.
It is what?
But
turn the camera off.
No, because they made a statement. They were one of the first CMOs to be bold in saying you can't train and we're going to take legal action. All that did happen, and I am privy to them. They're working on technical solutions.
Maybe they read your article. Maybe is that what you're trying to get at? That they nicked your idea? No, I'm gonna go back and come back to you on that. But yeah, I think there was some kind of solution based.
There is large organizations CMOs that are going to be making moves in the next 2-ish months.
Okay.
So
Behind
there
the
is,
scenes.
yeah. So there is.
Okay.
There is a few of them that really are challenging and pushing those boundaries, and but you bring up something really interesting about the whole generative conundrum and challenge, which also is a huge opportunity. Is that songwriters finally have a very interesting scenario here, because being behind the scenes and seeing how and learning a lot from Tamai and that team and at Voice Swap and all these companies. With generative music in particular, what's fascinating is that the copyright and composition side is incredibly valuable, and in some instances more so than the recorded master side, which makes it a huge opportunity to level set or even flip the table on how publishing and copyright's treated in streaming, which makes a share of what the master industry, recording industry makes.
Yeah.
So there is, like, again, another layer of reason of trying
Sure.
to build this out, and the publishing copyright industry, why they're galvanized to,
Because they did it with streaming, because I think it was the American Publishers Association took the DSPs to the table, said, wait a minute, we never negotiated these percentages with you, we want to talk about this, and took it to Congress, it was conversation, they upped it a bit, but it was, still. So there's leverage there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and again, why timing is so important, because they recognize that situation that they had to endure. They had to stomach the aftermath of not being at the table or whatever happened at that time.
Yeah.
Where now, like, no. We, CMOs are going to represent their membership.
Made that mistake before, we're not doing it again. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a lot happening. There's a lot of trial and uneducated error. There was a lot of disheartening conversations that feet are being dragged, but I think I'm hoping by the end of the year there's a few things that if they happen in time, it'll push the waves of this conversation in a different direction.
And if they don't happen in time, is there like a deadline here?
It's precedence setting.
Yeah.
If there's companies that make really big, bad deals, I think that precedent setting just sets it in stone, and then it's hard to undo.
Yeah.
And there's, yeah.
As with streaming,
Yeah. So that's why it's
sure.
kind of,
Okay.
I feel that on my back, our backs, because of that time. And the stakes are high, but also is the opportunity.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much, Michael. It's been
Yeah. Thanks,
fabulous.
Andy.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for
guys.
having me.